Hello everyone, I hope you're all enjoying the conference so far. I'm always very thankful when organizers give me the chance to speak to their audiences about my favorite topic in the world, CSS. And I want to take this opportunity to give huge props to the organizers of JS Fwdays for not only continuing with their conference series during this challenging time, but expanding the conference across Europe. Now today, I want to share with all of you an aspect of CSS that I find both fun and useful, and that is CSS custom properties, also known as CSS variables. Now, one of the more common use cases for CSS variables has been for handling color, and we will go through quite a lot of that, but CSS variables can also be used in many other ways, and we'll try to cover some of those as well over the next half an hour. But first, who am I? Well, my name is Hui Jing. It's a Chinese name, so my family name comes first name comes after. These emojis sprinkled around my avatar paint a relatively accurate picture of me and my interests, so if any of these emojis are interesting to you, you can feel free to ask me about them later if you want to. And I also have a day job with Shopify as a senior front-end developer because, my bills are not going to pay themselves. Anyway, back to the main topic of CSS custom properties. Unfortunately, this is a fully online conference, so it's a little harder to have real-time audience interaction. But at this point, I'm curious to see how many of you have ever read any of the CSS specifications? And I'm sure there are some of you, but I think there will also be a number of you who have not. Personally, I love CSS specifications, even those that were written in the very early days and were not really phrased in a way that the average human being could understand. Even those I love. Because to me, knowing what the CSS was intended for and how it was designed to be used makes it easier for me to use these CSS properties in my own projects. Now, the relevant CSS specification for today is called the CSS Custom Properties for Cascading Variables Module Level 1. That was a mouthful. This spec had been in the works for a long time, with the first public working draft published back in 2012. That's like a decade ago. And the original specification name was CSS Variables Module Level 1. So I guess that was the name that kind of stuck. Now, people who have been writing styles in CSS have been wanting to have some way to store values that repeatedly appear in their style sheets, because it honestly makes the code easier to maintain, right? Like when you needed to change something across the entire site, it could be something like a button color, accent color, font size, something, kind of global. It would be so much easier if you could just update it in one place and see the change propagate throughout the site, right? So the most popular CSS preprocessors like Sass, Less, and Stylus all had support for their respective variables. And these variables would eventually compile into actual CSS values as output during the build step. But if you wanted to dynamically update that variable, it wasn't really possible because it's static, right? The official Sass documentation explains this quite nicely. CSS variables, unlike Sass variables, are included in the CSS output. So they can have different values for different elements, but Sass variables will only ever be one single value set at compile time. Also, if you use a Sass variable and then you modify that value somewhere down your code, the previous usage of the variable is going to be that original value, not the new one. If you update a CSS variable, however, down the line, the previous usage of that CSS value would also be not modified. So this has implications because this unlocks certain capabilities that were not previously possible. Before we get into it, let's briefly run through the syntax of CSS variables and how to use them. So first of all, we have the variable definition that uses this double dash syntax that you see on the screen right now, like dash dash dinosaur, for example. And it's used to define the substitution value for var functions. We're going to talk about that later. Basically, this is where you set the value of your variable for use later in your CSS rules. And you're pretty free to name your CSS custom properties however you want for the most part. The general guidance I can give you is to just stick with letters, numbers, and dashes or underscores. I did try out a couple of other combinations just to see what worked and what didn't. So unlike CSS class names, numbers are fine if they come after the double dashes. So basically anything with double dash is pretty safe. So you can do double dash 42, that works. It's also case sensitive, so water capital M melon is different from watermelon lowercase m. Multiple dashes, you can as long as you have the first two, all the subsequent dashes, sure, good to go, do whatever you want. You can double dash underscore, pirate gold, that works. So those are the acceptable formats for names. On the right side are the things that your browser doesn't recognize, and I myself have done this mistake a couple of times where I just kind of forgot and I put my variable outside a selector. Sorry, browser doesn't understand that, so no go. You must have double dashes. I cannot emphasize this enough. No dash doesn't work. So fruit tomato, bang. Dash flower orchid, bang, single dash. Generally, special characters are also a no-go. So like no dollar signs, no at symbols, no ampersands. Just go with letters, numbers, dashes, underscores, and you'll be fine. So after you've had your variable defined, using them in your CSS requires this var notation. It's a function that takes in two arguments, your custom property that you have so carefully named, and an optional fallback value. Most of the time, I almost never see people use the fallback, and that's cool because it's optional, right? But sometimes I'm not sure if people don't know it exists or that they're not sure how it works. So let's cover that for a bit. The point of the fallback value is that if the custom property name for the first argument is not defined, then the fallback value will kick in. This whole concept of not defined, right? Like those of us who do front end, this is not a foreign concept. We see like undefined in JavaScript like all the time. So generally it's when the browser cannot match the variable to any value, right? So for here, let's say I can't spell dinosaur, spelled it wrong, dinosaur. The browser is like, oh, I don't know what dinosaur is. I'll just make the background maroon. But if I do a typo on the value itself, the browser actually knows that dinosaur is a value, but your value, because you typoed it, is moot, so it doesn't apply. So in that case, your fallback value does not kick in. So that's how it works. Okay, if you look at this code example, the selector I used up top, there's a colon root, that's the root selector, and if you look at most tutorials and blog posts about CSS custom properties, you will see the selector used fairly often. Because it represents the root element, defining your variables within this scope essentially makes your CSS custom properties global. CSS variables also has cascade and inheritance built in. And I did play around and experiment quite a bit to fully understand how things worked. So I'm gonna try to summarize what I realized about inheritance for these variable values. So depending on where you declare your variables, you can scope them to specific selectors, and then you can modify their values within descendants. However, for these values to take effect, they have to be used in properties on that element that you're trying to target. So now that I hear myself say this in words, it's a bit hard to understand. So hopefully the example can illustrate what I'm trying to say a little better. Right here, I have some elements set up already. I also have some custom properties like primary BG, which is set on the root. And then I have a primary text custom property that I've set on the divs. So these two divs. So both these variable values have been used on properties for the divs like background color and color. In addition, the first box, A box, also has a P element in it. And so we can see how it works here. So for A box, let's say I want to modify the primary background color, I can just update the variable value on the selector. Works as expected, lovely. But let's say I also want to change the text color of the P element. Thinking that, okay, let's just update primary text for A sentence. It lives in A box anyway, but let's say gold. You'll be like, hey, wait a minute. The border property on A sentence uses var primary text, and so it turned gold. That's great. But the text is still pink. And the reason for this is that I did not define the color property using the primary text variable on the P element. If I had wanted to make it take effect, I would have had to do something like this. Of course, if you, let's move to this, do it this way, I think it works. Yeah. So basically, the value has to be used on a property set on that element that you're trying to target. I'm just repeating myself, but hopefully this example kind of illustrates the point. In terms of debugging and the general development process, all major browser dev tools have pretty good support for CSS variables. In my opinion, the successful adoption of any new CSS really hinges on how well the accompanying dev tooling is for that new feature. But anyway, if you inspect an element that uses a custom property, hovering on top of the variable should give you the computed value. As you can see in the screenshots, all of them have a slightly different UI, but they will tell you the same answers. For Chrome, a nice touch is that if you click on the variable, like it is a link, if you look at it, you click on it, it will bring you to where the property was defined. So that's pretty neat too, in my opinion. So we've pretty much covered the basic principles of CSS variables and how they're used. So let's go into some more like real world like use cases. So like I mentioned at the start of the talk, popular use case for CSS variables is colors and theming, right? So the first example, the most cliched example you can think of, it's the dark light mode toggle. Now this particular example, I only want to focus on the CSS part, not the extra functionality like persistence across reloads. That needs a bit of JavaScript. We'll talk about that later. But the idea here is that your theme colors are stored in CSS variables so that when the toggle is checked like so, the variable values can be updated accordingly without having to override the original properties set on the elements. And I don't know about you, but like when I'm doing dev work and I'm debugging, especially for like bigger code bases that have lots of components, I know that DevTools will always show you the active property up top, but sometimes having like so many overrides just makes me feel like this is code that could have not been written. Okay, maybe that's just me, but anyway, you don't have to override the original properties, right? Okay, so this is the sprinkle on some JavaScript thing that I was talking about. If you really want something a little bit more production ready for dark light mode theming, you could consider sprinkling on this JavaScript to make use of local storage for persistence. Also, the use of data attributes instead of CSS classes could be a neat way of doing things from a code organization perspective, but it's a stylistic choice, right? We can use CSS classes, no problem. So the way the styles are is that the dark mode colors I define under dark theme, data theme dark, and then the attribute value gets modified on the onChange on the toggle, like so, and then make use of local storage to store this value and then check it every time the user reloads the page. That's pretty much how you persist the theme, I guess. But we're digressing from CSS variables now, so I'm gonna bring it back with this next example. I know I say basic, but I did choose a little bit of a fancier example here because I wanted to do a frame outline style, but with rounded borders and a gradient. So this happens to be a pretty odd combination because doing a gradient border and rounded corners is a surprisingly not straightforward thing to implement. It is possible though, like the code is a bit much, I guess, but ignoring the fanciness of things, this example here, I want this to highlight the use of inheritance of CSS variables and how the frame outline variable can be updated on different theme classes. And you can see that we have these 4 custom properties defined, but the point I'm trying to make here is that there's nothing stopping you from using one variable in another variable. Like these 2 gradient values here, they can be used to modify the frame outline variable for a different CSS class. And CSS variables can hold the full value of a CSS property, for example, this like entire linear gradient code. Or you could also just do a single value within a multi-value property. So multi-value properties are things like, border or background, like, they have different constituent parts. So background has lots of component parts. And specifically, let's talk about radial gradient because it's fun. It has quite a lot of components to it for different aspects of the gradient. And so by assigning my component values to CSS variables, the code for my variants becomes a lot neater. Because rather than having to redefine background and rewriting the entire radial gradient code, like I have a simple gradient here because I've gone with 2 colors for the color stop list, but it's a color stop list. So you can have like lots of colors. I don't think there's a limit. So your code could get a little bit verbose, especially if you're, if you want to update different things like the shape or the size and stuff like that. So here it's simplified. I only wanted to variabilize the position and the 2 colors. So my variant, so these are cards. It's like a card design, and there's like this radial gradient at the back, and I want each of the cards to have the focal point on a different corner of the card. All I had to do was to just redefine the position for each of the variants. So the default is left top, right? Left top, then right top, then left bottom, then right bottom. And if I wanted to update the color, also no big deal. Just do accent color here, update the value. Same for the other property, accent color. What other color can I use? Let's say pale green, I guess. I don't know. So things like this, right? You can do, and it really makes the code a lot nicer. And if you inspect the element, you don't get like those override cancellation rules in the DevTools. A little bit annoying for me. That's all I'm gonna say. And when you combine var with calc, oh, that's even better. Because browsers are really, really good at doing math. That's what I always tell everyone. Like, if you can, let the browser do math, let the browser do the math for you. Again, it's also another way to make the code neat because you can at least reduce the number of magic numbers in your style sheets. So this is not a complicated example. It's a size multiplier for managing various image sizes. So I could have a basic size multiplier and then have maybe a base size of 5ems for the small variant. Okay, let's just make it half the size. For a big one, we can make it double the size, and then you can modify the multipliers for different ratios if you want it to. Even modify the base size if you want it to. And of course, I think some of you at this point might be thinking, hang on. This that I just described right here, we can already do this with Sass variables, right? Correct. That is true. What I've described is on par with what Sass can achieve. But if you think about it, the fact that I could show you this demo live on the slides already demonstrates the difference between CSS and Sass variables. Like, being able to dynamically change the value of a CSS property and see its result in real time, I think it opens up creative possibilities that were kind of unfeasible to do in the past. And that's pretty cool. Like, for example, being able to update CSS variable values within media queries. I find this a very welcome addition because it allows us to do things like this. Right here, it's a font size ratio logic without having to explicitly create new variables for every point where the font size needs to change. I'm sure some of you must have come across code bases whereby you have like variables that are like base text size XL, base text size L, base text size MD, because for each of the breakpoints you needed to redefine a new variable. The code with CSS variables here is simplified because the font change can be handled with just two variables that I have here, text base size and text to heading ratio. And then I'm gonna let calc handle the rest, like the heading size and the margin. So set that the variables on the relevant properties, leave that alone, and at the different breakpoints where you want things to kick in fact, I'm just updating the ratio, and the browser handles the math for me. So I'm gonna try to open this in the bigger browser so you can actually see the effect that I'm going for. So this is like at the largest size, at the medium size, smaller size. Something like this, right? Go back. So a concept like this can be applied to numerous things like margins or paddings across different viewport sizes, image sizes. Anything that you'd like to have some mathematical relationship can now be done with CSS alone. And I think that's pretty handy. Of course, that doesn't mean that Sass is completely irrelevant now. I mean, it's still a rather useful tool. Things like functions and mix-ins are still great ways to make your code neater, and those don't ever get compiled into actual CSS. Like, if you have a design system with multiple sets of theme colors, you might end up having a lot of color variables, for example, and having all of them in the output CSS might not be the best idea. Sass, like preprocessor variables, right? They don't show up in the final output. So I think this is still something good to keep in mind. Like what this example you see on the screen here is an example from a very specific problem that the author was trying to solve for the generation of color variations. So it makes use of the really, really useful Sass color functions for alpha values, and then it further expands on the color modification functions for lightness and saturation. I know CSS color functions are on the horizon, but I think it's still early days, and the Sass versions are still very much relevant, honestly. If you do want to mix up Sass variables and CSS variables though, do remember that you will have to wrap the Sass variable within this like, what do you call this? Hash curly brace syntax so that everything gets parsed correctly at compile time. And CSS variables also gives you a more convenient mechanism for JavaScript to hook into your styles. So you can get a property value from using getPropertyValue and then your variable name, and then you can set the property, your variable value with setProperty. So this means that I have a pretty straightforward way for updating my CSS values with values calculated from JavaScript. For example, if I want to make something move with my cursor, I can grab the X and Y coordinates for on-mouse move, and then I can set those values on a transform property for the X and Y translation respectively. So if you look at the styles, like even if I include the styles that make that div look like a gradient ball, it's 5 lines of code. The key is actually this translate calc var mouse X line here. The JavaScript is also equally short. So I like this. I like this a lot. I like having short code, honestly. And like I mentioned earlier in the talk, right? Any interaction that can be translated into a mathematical relationship with an element style property can be leveraged to do some pretty interesting things. You could like generate colors based off your mouse position. No idea why you'd want to do that, but hey, you can. Just saying. And the key difference between modifying styles with JavaScript directly versus modifying the value of a CSS variable is the specificity advantage. Inline styles have a notoriously high specificity, which makes things trickier to manage, and especially if your styles coming in from different sources, you might end up in some unwanted specificity battles and debugging complications. Using CSS variables allows you to keep the styles within your CSS and reduce the number of overriding styles on the same element, as demonstrated in some of the previous examples that we've run through earlier. And if you want to look further into some future possibilities, you can also keep in mind the property at rule, which is part of the CSS Properties and Values API Level 1. That's the name of the specification, also known as CSS Houdini. This particular CSS module defines an API for registering new CSS properties. And they get a parse syntax defining the type, the inheritance behavior, and the initial value, as you can see the syntax on the screen here. Even though support is pretty much limited to Chromium-based browsers for now, I think it's still good to know how it works. And that it might be coming soon, you know? So one thing that we couldn't do in the past was to animate gradients that were set as background images, because the background image property is not an animatable property. If you think about it, the browser can only animate something if it knows how to interpolate between the start and the end values. So like background image could be lots of things. It could be like a URL. How are you gonna interpolate a URL, right? So the property at rule has a syntax descriptor. If you can see here, the syntax descriptor. It allows you to actually tell the browser the type of property that you're defining so that the browser knows what it needs to do to interpolate the value. So in this particular case, I'm telling the browser that this dash dash angle property that I'm defining, well, it's an angle. So there are a number of CSS types that you can put into for syntax. So this is essentially like type checking for CSS, right? So I've told the browser like, hey, this is an angle, and initial value is 0, it's fine. And then the keyframes code becomes really succinct, because I'm just telling it like, well, it's an angle. You know what an angle is. It uses degrees. Can you please interpolate it to 360 degrees? And then I make use of the animation property to make it go on forever. Like, hey, infinite. And this is something we couldn't do before, but hey, it's possible and it's coming soon. And there are just so many more possibilities that we could have with this. So I hope that it intrigues you enough to want to play around and explore on your own. So that's pretty much it for me. This is a list of really useful resources if you're interested in exploring more about this fascinating topic. And I really want to thank everyone for your time and attention. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Hi, Chen. How is it going?
Hi, it's good, it's good.
So we have a couple of questions. Thank you for your presentation. It was really intriguing and interesting a lot, and there are lots of questions. First one is take it like easy, and one of our visitors asks you, what is your favorite article in W3C?
I don't know about like articles that the W3C publish, but
Maybe something
if we're
that
talking
impressed you.
from the specification group, well, definitely more of the CSS related things. I do have like a favorite CSS property, and that's like the writing mode property. Yeah, and it's not relevant to CSS custom properties. So if anyone's interested in talking to me about that, you can like contact me offline. But if that's the question, yeah, that's my favorite spec.
Okay. I hope that one of one of them will contact you. Maybe in cases which are good for var annotation.
Yeah, so like the examples I showed during the talk, I think it's very relevant for things that you want to be updated dynamically. So something that involves a user interaction, those are very good candidates for uh, using CSS custom properties. Because in the past, if you wanted to change some styling, even something as straightforward, let's say an user clicked something and you want the styling of that thing to change, right? If you it used to be a little more complicated because you may have had to either add a new CSS class or you would have to add an inline style, and those are still valid, but like I mentioned, there's a specificity problem when that happens, especially if you have competing styles. The advantage of using the var notation, as you said, using CSS custom properties, is that it allows a easier management of specificity. So even if the interaction results in the update of a value, it maintains its original specificity, and that makes it easier for the other parts of your styles and your CSS to maintain their effect. So you don't have to keep overriding the override. So in a way, it helps in organizing CSS when you need to dynamically update your styles based on user interaction. That would be my recommendation.
Here is another related question. Are CSS variables better to use globally?
I wouldn't say better because without knowing what context the person is asking about, it could be good, it could be not so good. So it really depends on the type of value you want to store in the variable. So if it is a value that will be used like everywhere, maybe it could be like your application's main theme color. Oh, I think those are fine to put globally. But if your value is very specific to a specific component, and you know that that component only shows up in, say, maybe a specific section of your site, then maybe you'd want to scope your CSS variables to that component's styles. So because the reason I say that is, like I also mentioned in the presentation, is that if you put it globally, the thing about CSS custom properties is they show up in the final CSS output. So for the most part, it's not that big of a problem But I would imagine you have a very, very large application, and maybe you have up to hundreds of CSS variables. It might get a bit messy if everything is global. So that's my
Oh,
recommendation, is to kind of look at where this value needs to be used. Can you?
okay. Thank
Did
you
I drop off?
for
Can you hear me?
your Yeah, yeah, everything is okay. And is it possible to change the value of CSS variable, or it rather constant that variable?
So you can update it. It's a variable, which means that you can update the value of that variable with JavaScript. There's no need for a compile step. So if you had seen the presentation, you'd notice that there are a lot of demos where I'm actually typing, it's not a recorded video. It's the code actually updated in real time. So it was a very good example of showing people that if you update the value, it will show up in real time without needing a compile step like SAS or LESS, those pre-compiled CSS preprocessors. You can do it live in the browser, and that's why you can update these values using JavaScript, because like it could be a user event, it could be your browser changing size, for example. You can update your variable based on those events or those interactions. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, and one more question. Do CSS variables
No problem.
affect performance, or everything is native?
Well, it is native. So in terms of performance, I would say that it's not a very it's not really a major concern at this point. Where if you're concerned about updating a CSS variable slowing down your site, that's probably not going to happen. And yes, it is it's native to CSS itself, in that sense that it's not a library, right? It's not a module that you need to install. It just works because it is native CSS.
Okay, and one more question. It's like a situation, probably. When I look at the inheriting example, I feel confused about like array class dollar sign equal box. Are there any other alternatives of implementation? It was one in your examples about inheritance.
Okay, I'm not too sure what the person was confused about, but
Maybe
I guess yeah.
like a spelling, because it's like a little bit unusual. Maybe that's why he's asking, or she, I don't know.
Okay, if it's, I guess if it's because you're not used to the syntax of the two dashes, unfortunately that is the specification. You have to use it that way. So it's like any other CSS property. Like color is spelled COLOR. You can't change it. In terms of implementation, I can't really remember what that particular slide looks like. So I can't really imagine what part he or she is confused by. I mean, they could contact me on Twitter, and I like for more details,
Okay.
maybe. Yeah, because I don't really. Sorry.
No worries, it's okay. Maybe a person will just look to the documentation and it will be clear for him or she to
I
understand
hope so.
the syntax. Maybe one last question from my side. Is it hard to implement variables in my for example project? Is it hard to override everything from the zero?
Well, if you're trying to implement CSS variables into an existing code base that maybe used to use SAS, for example, I would suggest I won't say it's easy, but I also won't say it's difficult. It depends on how big your code base is. And my recommendation is to do it part by part. So depending on how you already organize your existing and I'm assuming you are moving from a like an SCSS code base to CSS variables. For the most part, you can almost do a direct replace. So let's say originally your variable was maybe a dollar sign primary color equals something. You can just change it to 2 dashes primary color equals that value.
Okay.
And then in the usage, you have to use the VAR notation, but it can be a one-to-one replacement. And that could be a start. And then as you go through each component, there you could kind of see if there are certain things that CSS variables can do extra. But otherwise, in terms of, I would say, capability, it's almost a one-to-one match. So I won't say that it's very difficult to migrate over.
Okay, thank you for your answers and thank you for your talk, Hui Jin.